you'll be happy to know that I've been trying these last few days. I've been in town for a few days now to sort of learn some of the Danish culture. So I've been to this place, and I saw this statue, and I went to the city hall that I didn't really fit in very well. And I also discovered Glog. Can somebody tell me if I'm pronouncing that right? Okay, I can see a couple shaking heads. Which was actually my favorite discovery of this trip because where I am from in Michigan, it's actually colder there than it is here. So this was a strange, nice warm-up trip for me. So this discovery of hot wine was actually really something that I need to bring back because our winters are not very fun either. So I am a developer advocate at Progress. I have a couple other facts about me, but I'm going to come back to myself a little bit later in this talk because this is a talk that's actually about TypeScript. And real quickly, I just sort of want to gauge the room here. I'm going to ask you a number of questions today. How many people use TypeScript today in projects? Oh, wow. So I'd say that's something about roughly around half the hands in the crowd here. How many people consider themselves JavaScript or front-end developers here? Okay, so that one's a little bit more like a third. Yeah, I've actually found it interesting at this conference because there is not a whole lot of front-end related talks. When you go to the schedule, I don't see much JavaScript or TypeScript out there. So this is a talk about TypeScript, but I do want to just set expectations right from the start here. This is not a talk where I'm going to go over really advanced syntactical features of the TypeScript language. We're not going to dive into the really deep stuff. And in fact, if you're paying attention closely, two of these terms I just completely made up. Structural detection and sequential piping are not actually real things, although they really seem like they could be, right? If you wanted to take that and run with it, you're welcome to do that. But instead, I'm going to tell a little bit of a story about why I personally was wrong about TypeScript. So a handful of years ago, I had sort of an important decision to make. I took a really strong stance against TypeScript, and with the benefit of the hindsight, that did not work out so well. And so what I want to do is tell you a little bit of my story, the background behind TypeScript, and what I hope you get out of this from sort of a practical or a pragmatic perspective is really through these experiences and through some of the features of the TypeScript language that I'm going to be pointing out and walking you through today, I hope you'll get a sense of whether TypeScript is a good fit for your next project, or if you're already using TypeScript, maybe some things that you might want to choose to use, or whether you want to continue using TypeScript into the future. But I did promise a story about why I was wrong about TypeScript, and so that's where I'm going to get started. And things really start back with, TypeScript was actually released back in 2012, if you can believe that. And the line they sort of open with, and this is the line that still appears in their website to this day, is that TypeScript is a type superset of JavaScript that compiles to plain JavaScript. Now, what I thought was interesting about this, back when I saw it back then, is this bit about compiling to JavaScript. Because if you just think of TypeScript as really a tool that compiles code into JavaScript, it puts it into the same class as a number of other tools that have been around for a very long time. In fact, the origin of compile-to-JavaScript tools dates back to really the beginning of the World Wide Web. At this time, thinking back to the sort of 90s, the late 90s, JavaScript was very much a toy language. It was a language that people like me used to build things like this. GeoCities sites and AngelFire sites as well, or sites that looked like this. These, by the way, being actual real websites I built that inexplicably are on the web archive to live for all time. So I get to relive these moments of my high school and university time till the end of time. They will never die. So I was using JavaScript at the time to do all the things that you needed to do with JavaScript, which is start your Flash animations for your intros to your websites. You need that. If you're building a Final Fantasy fan site, how do you not have auto-playing Final Fantasy music? I mean, this is just sort of a given in the late 90s. I use it to drive this poll that you see on the right-hand side of the screen. So I was doing some really super cool things with the language. An interesting thing happened, though. Over time, JavaScript went from this toy that people like me were doing really nonsense things with to something that was becoming increasingly valuable and important to businesses and really important stuff. People like this were suddenly very interested in JavaScript and needing JavaScript for their important business processes. Now, for people like me, and for those of you that consider yourself JavaScript or front-end developers, of course, this was amazing, right? Suddenly I went from, I'm building stuff like this, and then suddenly people are willing to pay me to do that work. This is how my career started. This is the reason I'm standing up here on stage. I went from building toy things to something that people considered very valuable. So of course, I love this. But for a lot of other people, this was not a very great thing. And JavaScript is considered, especially if you look back, one of the more hated languages of all time. I mean, a lot of developers that are more accustomed to writing Java, C#, Ruby, you name the languages, have really historically, and even to this day, looked down upon JavaScript. So for these people, this was not so great. And you'd point out some of the weird edge cases of JavaScript. You've probably seen memes like this, or this one happens to be my personal favorite. This one is quite clever, so I actually can go along with this one. But what this led to is that since developers wanted to be writing their code in some other language, oops, I keep switching back to that, wanted to be writing their code in some other language, but needed to write JavaScript, right, for their important business applications, it led to them trying to create a lot of compile-to-JavaScript tools. They wanted to write their code in, say, Ruby or Python or Erlang or Java or whatever language that might be, but they needed that code to actually compile into JavaScript code. And so at some point, the CoffeeScript team, and I'll talk about CoffeeScript here in a minute, just generated a giant list of these things, just all these different compiled JavaScript tools that had been written over time. And as you can see, first of all, there are hundreds of these, right? 300 some projects, and I think there more have been written over time. And what I find interesting about this is that virtually any language that's out there, someone at some point has written some tool to compile that code into JavaScript code. Now, I looked through this entire list so that you wouldn't have to, and I did pick out some of my favorites because not all of these are production-ready tools, right? These aren't tools that are all used in important applications to write important things. So there's things called Tree Hugger, which I thought was quite clever because it deals with abstract syntax trees, so I thought that was a little fun. There's one called Djangaroo. There's one called Water Bear, which, of course, does actually have its own mascot, which I thought was pretty well done. So there are some jokes on here. There are some research projects. A lot of these are, somebody had a university project to make these sort of things possible and work. But there are a number of extremely serious tools. Large companies spent a lot of time and a lot of effort building some of these projects, some of these tools, as serious efforts to replace JavaScript or giving developers some other way of writing web code using a language that wasn't JavaScript. So what I want to do today is I want to talk about two of the tools that I personally feel have been the most successful. So we're going to look at CoffeeScript, and we're also going to look at Dart. And what I want to do is show you a little bit of just how those projects went over the last handful of years, and use that to show why TypeScript's path has been different. CoffeeScript and Dart ultimately were not successful, not things that we're talking about today, whereas TypeScript is. So the first on my list is CoffeeScript, and continuing to poll here, how many people here have written a line of CoffeeScript code? That is more than I expected. Okay, so I'd say that's something like 15 or 20% of people. TypeScript was written in 2009, and if you went to a conference like this in around 2011 or 2012, you absolutely would have heard a talk about CoffeeScript. You would have heard about whether CoffeeScript was a good fit for your next project. If you look at, for example, Google Trends data, so just measuring raw search traffic for a given term over time, you can see that CoffeeScript had quite a heyday around this time, 2011, 2012, where it was actually quite popular, something that people were searching for and using in their projects. I looked up, for example, Fluent Conference, which is a popular conference in the US. It's sort of a front-end developer-related conference. And their 2011 schedule was still up on the internet, and there was actually 4 talks on CoffeeScript. So again, conferences like this was something that people cared about, a tool that people were considering using. But ultimately, the trend line, of course, went down. Over time, CoffeeScript sort of fell out of favor. It's not something that we're commonly talking about. There are 0 CoffeeScript talks that you can attend at GOTOcon. I'm sorry if you were really looking forward to seeing that. And there are a number of different reasons, like we could discuss for a long time here why that happened, because there's a multitude of reasons. You could make an argument that JavaScript as a language has just gotten better. A lot of the things that CoffeeScript used to do are just now part of JavaScript itself, so there's less of a need to have a transpiler like this do this for you. But personally, I think it comes down to the code itself. So if you look at CoffeeScript, this is the very first code sample that you will see on their website. This is what they use to show you what CoffeeScript code looks like. And to me, as someone that has done JavaScript for a long time, most of this does not look familiar, right? Like, I don't really know what's going on here, other than maybe, so the arrow functions in CoffeeScript actually were some of the inspiration behind arrow functions coming to JavaScript. So I do, nowadays, understand a little bit of what that's doing, but, this sort of thing and over here, it's just stuff that feels unfamiliar to me as a JavaScript developer. And this sort of thing just makes the learning curve for getting into a tool like this so much harder, because suddenly you have to understand and learn some brand new concepts and just to be able to write code with this new framework or this new library. The thing is, though, These features would feel familiar if you are coming from a Ruby background, because CoffeeScript largely came out of the Ruby community and got integrated into a lot of Ruby tooling. For example, the Ruby on Rails project integrated CoffeeScript fairly early and used it throughout, I keep losing that, throughout a lot of the tooling that they built. So CoffeeScript ultimately found a nice niche in the Ruby community, but failed to take off sort of mainstream within the JavaScript world. The next thing I want to talk about is Dart. So I'm going to ask the same question here. How many people here have written a line of Dart code at some point? All right, this one's a little less. I think I see about 6 hands going up in the screen. And actually, I think, for some reason, I keep switching into this slide. So real quickly, I am just going, I don't know what's up with this conference slide, but it is going away. It was a really weird effect. We'll go back to Dart and play this from the current slide, and hopefully PowerPoint, either that or this building is just possessed or something. I don't know why the slide deck keeps doing that. So this is Dart. I'm going to show the same Google Trends data from Dart as well. And this one's actually quite interesting, right? Like if you squint, you might see a small change in the graph somewhere in here. Because you see, Dart actually had a lot of hype and a lot of interest in the tool right away. And the reason for this is that Dart was a tool that was built by Google. And this time frame, so this is late 2011, this is when Chrome's market share was starting to really skyrocket and really peak, and Chrome was really taking over the browser market. And so a lot of articles were written, is Dart a JavaScript killer? People were conjecturing that maybe Google is building Dart specifically to try to replace JavaScript as the thing we write browser code for. And so this generated a lot of controversy. That's why you see the Google Trends data up so high. But of course, ultimately, Dart was not something that really succeeded in the JavaScript world. Actually, just real quick, one quick note. I found as I was sort of researching this that Dart was released at a GOTOcon in Denmark. And it was actually part of a keynote in 2011, which I thought was interesting. And then I also heard before this that TypeScript was actually announced at GOTOcon as well. So apparently, this event has quite the history of launching a number of these tools. So just a quick note, something I found fascinating. I was looking through this. But again, Dart ultimately did not find success among the JavaScript community. And again, the story here is potentially quite complicated. You can make the same argument that JavaScript just got better as a language, which is one of the reasons this tool fell off. But I would again argue that a large part of it is due to the code itself. So this is, again, sort of the HelloWorld in Dart. This is one of the first things you'd see. I again, pulled this from one of the 2011 articles that I dug up. And if you ask me as a JavaScript developer, again, I would say this does not look like JavaScript code, right? Like to me, this looks more like C# or maybe Java, some things like that. And remember, this is 2011, so there is no class keyword in JavaScript yet. So if you're a JavaScript developer looking at this is going to look even more unfamiliar to you than it does today. There was also the small problem that HelloWorld and Dart compiled into 17,000 lines of JavaScript code, which is sort of a minor oversight. The Dart team would eventually optimize that away, right? That wasn't a long-term problem, but it wasn't exactly the best, foot to get off on when trying to appeal to the JavaScript development world. Now, Dart is still around. You actually might have heard the talk before and this track about Flutter. Dart is used in the Flutter project. It's also used in a lot of other sort of Google-related tools. There's a Dart conference happening next year. But Dart has removed their option of compiling into JavaScript. The Dart project now is exclusively used through their own sort of VM, and they've sort of abandoned the notion from compiling to JavaScript altogether. So it's another project that ultimately failed to find success, at least as a JavaScript replacer in that market. So that brings us up to TypeScript. TypeScript was released in October of 2012 by Microsoft. And TypeScript's fate started to look like it was going to just sort of follow the exact same trend line. So if you look at TypeScript and how it fared between, say, 2012 when it was announced and through the end of 2014, it looked like the TypeScript project was just going to be this tool that some people used. It was available in Visual Studio, but that it wasn't something that was going to find mass adoption amongst the JavaScript community. And this is really what brings us to my story and when I get involved in this project and why I was wrong about TypeScript. So I work as a developer advocate for a company called Progress. In Progress, we make software, we sell software, and we're a software development company. And my job as a developer advocate, or one of my responsibilities, is to keep tabs on the development world. What technologies are developers using? What technologies do developers hate? Obviously, we want to invest and build tools for things that are on the rise, and we want to divest and get out of tools that are on the decline. It's one reason that I go to sort of events like this and try to hear what developers are interested in using. So around that time at Progress, this is 2014, we were working on this really cool, hip new project that we called NativeScript. So NativeScript is our tool for allowing developers to build iOS and Android apps using JavaScript. We were pretty excited about it. There was years long of internal engineering, and we were getting ready to sort of build the final pieces, like the final APIs, and start to unveil and promote NativeScript to the world. And so me as a developer advocate, I remember very vividly being given access to this repo. Like it was a real big internal thing that was being developed, and I was being granted access to this to provide feedback. I was in there to say, pretend you were just a generic JavaScript developer, you're tossed into the repo, tell us what you think, tell us how successful you are, what sort of feedback do you have. So this was the feedback. I used GitHub to go back in time a little bit to 2014, around the time I went in there. And I still remember one of the very first things I noticed, because I wasn't familiar with this sort of layer of the NativeScript stack, the one developers would actually be using. I remember seeing these .d.ts files, which here's a sort of closer look at this, which if you're not familiar are TypeScript's definition files. It's basically some of the things that make the typing system in TypeScript work. Now to me, when I saw this, if you put yourself in my shoes, this was start red flags, start screaming, sirens going off, because I'm thinking in my head, right, like TypeScript, who's using TypeScript, right? You look at the trends data, no one's writing about TypeScript. I go to conferences, there's no TypeScript talks. Developers are gonna get in this repo and they're gonna be confused. They're gonna have to Google what the heck we're actually using to build this thing. TypeScript was built by Microsoft, and Microsoft of 2014 was not cool. Microsoft hadn't started doing a lot of the things they've done recently to really appeal to the front end and the JavaScript community. So Microsoft was a dirty word back in 2014. TypeScript's tooling was also tied up with Visual Studio. So TypeScript, you could use it outside of Visual Studio, but the really nice tooling experience that we'll look like in a minute was only available in Visual Studio. So this is, again, a problem for me because Visual Studio, if you say what you will about the editor, but it's a niche market. Only a certain segment of developers are actually using Visual Studio. And with NativeScript, we want to have broad appeal. We want to appeal to the entire JavaScript community. We want a lot of people to use NativeScript. So I did what's always a good idea, and I decided to put my thoughts down in an email that will never die. And I said things to the NativeScript team. I said, it's time to I'm Mr. DevRel, I know what I'm doing here, right? Like super confident. I'm gonna swoop in here, I'm gonna save the day, I'm gonna make this product a lot better. So I made this argument where I said things like, we risk a lot by building our core on top of TypeScript. I don't hear anyone talking about TypeScript, again, citing how there's basically zero talks out of the little Microsoft bubble about TypeScript and what TypeScript is doing. At some point, I wrote a public blog post that was anti-TypeScript where I used the phrase, I like to keep my JavaScript pure as God intended. Just sort of my view on the things. Like I'm very much a developer that does not like adding dependencies to anything I do, right? So the thought of adding anything to my JavaScript code, JavaScript's my baby language. It's the language I learned in. Why would I want to mess with pure JavaScript by adding on this additional little tool? So that was my thought back then. And that was my argument and my sort of reasoning process. But an interesting thing happened right after this. So first of all, my feedback was taken into consideration. The NativeScript team at least I feel that they value my feedback and they seriously considered this. But at the end of the day, I wasn't the one actually building the thing, right? I was working with the team that was working on developing these APIs. And ultimately, they said that they thought TypeScript was a good tool and that it made them more productive and that they wanted to move forward with TypeScript. And if you fast forward to nowadays, you'll see that TypeScript is now associated very publicly with everything we do with NativeScript. If you Google NativeScript, you'll have a hard time finding us not talking about our TypeScript support. We talk about how you build great apps with NativeScript and TypeScript. We were one of the very first case studies on the TypeScript website, so we proudly proclaim NativeScript support for TypeScript. So nowadays, an interesting thing changed where we went from me trying to push against it to now we are very publicly pro-TypeScript. And to show sort of visually what changed, so I've been showing a lot of Google Trends data. This is what happens if you put TypeScript, Dart, and CoffeeScript into the same sort of chart. And you can see, so I'm going to, this is February of 2015, and you can see TypeScript has a little bit of a push there at the end, but they're all operating, all three of these technologies are operating in the same spectrum of the chart. Nothing drastically is different. Dart's a little bit lower, but not super significantly. Now what I did is yesterday I took this exact same chart, but I fast-forwarded the end to this month, like the beginning of November. And there's going to be a very small change that's going to happen here. So really focus hard on these lines because it might be hard to see the difference. You'll see that something small happened between 2015 and 2018. The very, very slight change to one of these frameworks to make it significantly more successful. So I was wrong, clearly. But what I want to discuss is why I was wrong. And I think some of the lessons I learned are something that you might be able to use as you evaluate your own technologies, when you hear about things throughout this conference or at your job and whatnot as well. Now, first of all, some very good just sort of marketing things happened to TypeScript shortly after this, around 2015. So one really big one is that Microsoft announced a partnership with Google that the next version of the Angular framework would be built with TypeScript. Now, this was big just straight up, really from a PR perspective, just because AngularJS has millions of users. It did, and it does to this day. And all of a sudden, all of those users now, at the very least, knew TypeScript exists. They probably might not have even heard of the thing beforehand. And they also knew that the next version of the framework that they're using and that they're probably depending on for their production apps was switching to this technology. So there's a high chance that they're going to at least check this thing out and run it through its paces and see if it's something that they can use for their next applications. So this was a big deal for TypeScript. The other one was this small little editor called Visual Studio Code. I'm going to poll the audience again. How many code users do we have here? So that is like, I'd say just over half of the people. When I asked this question at front end, like specific talks, I swear it's crazy. It's now like 80 or 90%. Like it's absolutely phenomenal to me how many people are using code and the success this editor has had. And you could make a strong argument that a good part of TypeScript's success is really just tied to code. So what code did is, I mentioned earlier that really good TypeScript support and tooling was really tied to the Visual Studio editor. So a Windows-only paid editor that only a certain number of developers use. Code was designed as a cross-platform editor. So all of a sudden, this TypeScript tooling, which is built directly into Visual Studio Code, as I'll show here in a minute, was now available for not only Windows, but also Mac OS and Linux. Oh, and it was also free as well. So the barrier to actually trying this and to finding an editor that supports and shows off TypeScript really well suddenly went from very high to really nothing, the basement. You don't have to pay or really do anything to try these things out. Along this time, you also started to see a number of people just sort of saying really glowing things about TypeScript. So this is Tom Dale, who's one of the people behind the Ember project, saying he's sold on TypeScript. This is Dave Herman, who works on the JavaScript specifications, saying that TypeScript is, quote, a lovely piece of technology. You also started to see a number of companies saying really nice things about TypeScript, and specifically about TypeScript, or how TypeScript has helped them build applications at scale and working within their organization. So this is probably my favorite one. You could find it on Medium about TypeScript as Slack, where they talk about how the Slack app has benefited greatly from switching over to TypeScript. If you're using a JavaScript framework, there's a good chance that you're working with TypeScript in some fashion nowadays. I talked earlier about how Angular is now written with TypeScript. The Vue framework has recently announced that the next version of Vue, Vue 3.0, is going to be written with TypeScript. So that's a pretty big change to that ecosystem as well. And React is still written with JavaScript, but they did recently announce that the main React CLI, the Create React app, will now have built-in TypeScript support, so you can easily generate React projects that let you use TypeScript out of the box. So when we look at why I was wrong, I think certain parts of this were related to sort of the marketing aspect of this, the TypeScript name getting out there more, getting some more positive PR and such. But there's a lot more to it than that. And to explain it, I want to tell you a little bit about how developer relations work, just in case you're not familiar. So if you ever want to apply for a DevRel job, do we have any DevRel people in here? All right, good. I can tell you all the secrets about the DevRel job. So DevRels really, in a nutshell, are half engineering and half marketing. That's basically what we do. And I sort of like to think of this as having an angel on one of my shoulders and a devil on the other. That's sort of like my mental model for this. Because I know the devil is here, because I know marketing works to an extent. There's a certain value from just having this information out there, like having the TypeScript name out in front of people. I mean, heck, part of the reason I'm here today is because I work on the NativeScript team, and for those of you that haven't heard of NativeScript before, at least you now know the name, and maybe if you decide to build a mobile app, you would consider using NativeScript. But I also know that the engineering part of the equation is actually far more important. Developers aren't stupid people, and you can't make them use a tool that they don't like or that doesn't solve a problem for them. Or at least you have a really hard time making them use a tool that they don't like, and they will not be happy with you if you make them do that. And so, for example, if I told you NativeScript is a great tool, and you went back to your office and went to build a NativeScript app and it sucked, you're not going to use NativeScript, right? So ultimately, the engineering aspect of this is actually far more important. And when I look at why I was wrong about TypeScript, it was because I was thinking of things more from a marketing perspective. I was making arguments like TypeScript won't succeed because I don't see people using it, or it's a tool by Microsoft. My arguments weren't that this isn't a genuinely useful piece of technology that solves an important problem that developers have. And when I did actually give TypeScript a fair chance and sort of evaluate it from a technical perspective, I do think it does a couple of things very right. And I think the technical bits are why it didn't suffer the same fate as projects like CoffeeScript and like Dart. So this time I'm going to give you 3 reasons why I think from a technical perspective TypeScript has done quite well, and why I think it's a pretty valuable piece of technology that you might want to use for your own applications. So the first of these is that TypeScript made an important commitment to the JavaScript or the ECMAScript standard. And what I mean by that, actually, the TypeScript team says it quite well themselves. So this is a quote that's from the original blog post when Microsoft first published TypeScript way back in the day. And it's kind of long, but I want to read it because I think it sets the foundation for why I personally believe TypeScript was successful. The quote says, "Some examples of compile-to-JavaScript frameworks, so like Dart and also like CoffeeScript that we talked about, portend that JavaScript has fundamental flaws, and to support those scenarios requires a clean break from JavaScript in both syntax and runtime. We disagree with this point of view. We believe that with committee participant focus, the standard's runtime can be expanded, and the syntactic features necessary to support JavaScript at scale can be built on top of the existing JavaScript standard." Now this is important. Think back to the Dart example that I showed earlier and also the CoffeeScript example that I showed earlier as well. There was a huge learning curve there because that code was not JavaScript code. Both of those projects made a decision early on that they weren't going to build on top of JavaScript. They were going to instead build a completely separate way of architecting and writing your code and compile into JavaScript. TypeScript took a different approach and chose to build on top of JavaScript, which I think is actually quite important. Now to show that, I'm going to start to show a few code examples to you here. Now, this is what's called the TypeScript Playground. So if you go to TypeScript's website, which is at typescriptlang.org, and this last tab is for the playground, which takes you to this UI you see here. It's a great place to just start tinkering with TypeScript, especially if you're new to the tool, because basically how it works is that you write TypeScript code on the left-hand side of the screen. So this would be like your .ts or your TypeScript file. And what you see is the output or the JavaScript code that TypeScript generates. And what's cool is that if you try this and you start off with some basic things, like if you just write the world's simplest for loop here, you can see that TypeScript actually doesn't need to do anything with that. It just takes that code that you write and just makes it your .js or your just JavaScript implementation. This essentially, why I think this is important, is it essentially takes the learning curve for JavaScript developers to 0, right? You could take your .js files and just make them .typescript files and just start writing your code as is and slowly add in other features of TypeScript as you become more comfortable with it. It just makes getting started with the framework and with the approach far more plausible. Now, on top of this, TypeScript actually, because it's stuck with the JavaScript standards, has become one of the leading ways that you can just use newer features of the JavaScript or the ECMAScript standard in a way that's going to continue to work for whatever, say, browsers or JavaScript runtimes that you need to use. So for example, the class keyword is a newer feature of JavaScript, but if you want to use the class keyword in the apps that you're building today, but you need to support, say, for example, older browsers, you can rely on TypeScript to transpile that code into JavaScript that's going to work in that environment. There are a number of other features as well. For example, maybe you want to use the extends keyword, which is actually a really new feature of JavaScript. You could do that in TypeScript right away and let it deal with the sort of messy rendering or how it handles making that code work in the environments you need your JavaScript code to run in. So I got a few more examples here, like arrow functions. If you want to use those in a safe way today, you can do that. Multi-line strings, which is a fun feature of JavaScript, you can do that. Template literals, code that works like this, is another one that you can do with TypeScript today. And I sort of cherry-picked a few more examples in here, but TypeScript is actually extremely compliant to the standards and lets you use a lot of the really new features of JavaScript immediately, and in a way that keeps your code running, especially if you need to support older browsers or older runtimes. Now, one thing that does come up when I show this quite a bit is people wonder, well, what if I don't need to support older browsers? What if I'm using TypeScript to write a Node app where I know exactly what my runtime is? Or maybe I know my users are going to be on newer versions of browsers, or maybe we don't support those older browsers. So the TypeScript command line interface, which you can download from their website as well, and really anytime you're using TypeScript, the TypeScript compiler, has a flag or a way of configuring the target that you're using. So by default, it's going to render your code in an ES3 environment, so a very old version of JavaScript. It's essentially a way of making sure your JavaScript is going to run virtually anywhere. But you could, if you want, change that to run in something like ES 2015 or ES 2016. And if you make your target a newer version of the JavaScript runtime, essentially what it'll do is just take the code that you write here and again, just port it out exactly as is. There'll be no need to transpile, kind of like we looked at with a very simple for loop. So really, I think the main reason, so again, this is 3 reasons why I think TypeScript succeeded and did very well. One is just because it committed to the ECMAScript standard and because the framework is built on top of JavaScript. It's been really familiar, really comfortable, really easy for JavaScript developers to use, and has been a really successful way to just let people leverage newer features of the JavaScript language. Second reason is that the typing system in TypeScript. So TypeScript has types. It's sort of in the name of the framework. But I think it's important that they made the types opt-in. And to explain that, I'll go back to a couple code examples here. So the way you apply types in TypeScript is you use the syntax where you use a little colon, then you apply the type that you want to use to the value you're using here. But you could, if you wanted to, because you can see this has no effect on the generated code whatsoever. It's just spitting out the exact same thing. So you could actually just get rid of the type and your code is going to work exactly as is. Now, why I think this is important is because it, again, lowers the learning curve. You're not forced to, like you would be with some other frameworks, as soon as you switch to TypeScript, immediately start applying types to everything that you do. You sort of have the choice as a developer to start as you learn the type system and as you become more familiar with it, and as you want to leverage it more, to slowly enhance your code with types that are just going to enhance your productivity as a developer. And actually, TypeScript as well is pretty smart. The TypeScript compiler in many cases can infer types without an explicit declaration. So for example, TypeScript here knows that this value is a string, and some of the tooling that we're going to look at here in a minute can automatically suggest completions based off that string without you needing to explicitly tell the TypeScript compiler what type of value that this is. Now, I started really hesitant about types. This is one of the reasons I was super hesitant to use TypeScript. Even though I am a longtime JavaScript developer, I did spend many years in the Java world. I wrote a lot of Java applications. And one of the things that was refreshing to me about writing JavaScript code is that I didn't have to write types, right? Like, I'd spent so much time in JavaScript, Java had sort of broke me, right, on types. And it was just so clunky, and it was refreshing to get out of that with JavaScript. But TypeScript's approaches work quite well. And if you look at a lot of the write-ups from companies that have switched to TypeScript, one of the things you'll see quoted a whole lot, and this is the one that Slack put out, their quote is, "We were surprised by the number of small bugs we found with converting our code." Type conversion is one of the most silly and common errors in JavaScript applications. I can't tell you how many times I've had a 0 that was supposed to be a string or some sort of weird string to number conversion. And you see this line about finding bugs over and over again. On the NativeScript project, I was actually just last week talking with one of our plugin developers that's sort of tasked with converting or making a lot of our NativeScript plugins TypeScript compatible. And he mentioned the same thing to me, that he was actually able to close a number of GitHub issues that he found simply by switching to TypeScript and assigning types to the code he used. So even if you're hesitant to switch into typing, I think you'll find a lot of value from doing so. So I mentioned 3 reasons why I thought TypeScript was successful. The first was the commitment to the standards. Second was about the typing system and how things are opt-in. The third on my list is tooling. And this is probably what I feel is the single most valuable or the single most important reason why TypeScript succeeded. So the examples I've been showing so far have been fairly basic, but you can do a whole lot with TypeScript. So for example, even in this simple Playground environment that's browser-based, you can see that TypeScript is quite good about providing intelligent suggestions for things like types and the methods that you can use. It'll also do things like tell you when you do things you're not supposed to do, right? Like try to use a function or a method that doesn't exist, or try to assign a value of one type that you shouldn't be allowed to do. It'll flag that sort of error as well. Now, this gets more powerful when you switch out of the browser-based environment like this Playground and into an editor that you'd probably use for your professional development. So there are a number of different editors nowadays that have really good TypeScript support, but I find that most people, at least myself personally, use TypeScript through an editor like Visual Studio Code. And you can see that you get a pretty similar experience, a nice autocomplete as you type your code, a nice easy way to process through your application development. And this is something, by the way, that if you are a JavaScript developer, this is something that we're not traditionally used to. The idea, I've seen editors over the years try to provide this good of an experience and really fail to do so. But in a way, it brings a lot of the features that really more server-side developers, back-end developers have loved about their language into JavaScript in a pretty seamless way. Another just small thing, like you can poke around your code. Like this is a feature of Java editors that I used to love, that if you're in a file, and VS Code at least, it's command-click, and you can sort of pick around your files and poke around without having to manually open each of these files. For the type system, one nice thing about TypeScript being so popular today is that if you are using a library or a framework, someone somewhere has almost certainly written types, so those .d.ts files that I showed earlier, that's essentially making the typing system work for the TypeScript compiler and the TypeScript tooling that you saw in Visual Studio Code. So for example, if you're using Node or you're using React, or even if you're using something like jQuery, these types are available, they're on NPM, they're easily installable into your apps, and you get some nice autocomplete, some nice functionality for your editor as you develop your code. And fun story too, so you might have caught earlier on one of my slides that I used to be a member of the jQuery team. So back in the day, I used to write an enormous amount of jQuery code. And I can't tell you the number of times, I'd actually be embarrassed if you knew, the number of times I went to the jQuery API docs to just look up the stupid syntax of the AJAX function or the animate function. Because it's amazing how little, even with APIs you use every day, how quickly that goes in your brain and immediately out when you no longer need to use this. And actually, one of the things I found most valuable about TypeScript is using these libraries, because these aren't APIs that I'm super familiar with. These aren't things that I wrote myself. And so I've been doing some Angular work recently, and you can see some of the things that TypeScript provides. For example, if I go into this package and I just need to see what classes or what things are in here, TypeScript knows, and it's able to suggest and help me build these things. It's going to know things about what properties or what attributes are required from the methods I'm using. I get some nice inline documentation. I get some suggestions of how I might want to use these APIs. It's going to know what values are required, which values are optional. And if I don't provide required ones, it's going to yell at me and tell me what I need to do. If I'm trying to provide optional attributes, it'll offer suggestions, values. If I try to pass in a string when the API wants a number, this is another thing from jQuery. Sometimes you'd pass in numbers and it wanted strings, and some bizarre things happens in the browser. Just being able to catch these things kind of early, it's not huge, right? But over time, this is an enormous productivity boost for your development processes. Now, in NativeScript specifically, we're actually doing some pretty fun things with TypeScript. So one of our most compelling features with NativeScript, so again, we're a framework that lets you build iOS and Android apps using JavaScript. And most of the code you write with NativeScript is cross-platform. So it's in a way that's going to work across iOS and Android at the same time. But we also recognize that when developers write native applications, at some point they're going to need to do iOS or Android specific things. It's sort of inevitable. Maybe I want to do a quick tweak to the status bar in my iOS app. Maybe there's some IoT sensor that I need to use some Android SDK to use. And so this is great, but one problem is that we're primarily trying to make NativeScript appeal to web developers. And web developers tend not to be the people that have an encyclopedic knowledge of all of the iOS and Android API domain. It's just not a skill set that they possess. So one thing we've done is we've created TypeScript definitions for the entirety of iOS and Android, which this melts your mind just a little bit, right? Because this is Visual Studio Code. This is a TypeScript project. And what I'm doing here is I'm basically writing iOS code, which is a little bit weird to think about. But what's cool is that we're essentially providing more or less like an Xcode-like experience or an Android-like experience within a TypeScript app. We've also found through doing this, we've been able to appeal more to native app developers, which is a market we didn't necessarily think we'd appeal to. But because we can make a cross-platform framework feel a little more at home for those sorts of developers that are used to this sort of experience in frameworks like Xcode and Android Studio, that they actually find TypeScript development more appealing. And actually, I have a Java one in here too. The Java one is even weirder in my head. It's because something about typing java.lang.string in like a Visual Studio Code TypeScript project just sort of messes with my head a little bit. But it's something that is possible for you to do using NativeScript. So hopefully you've got an idea of why I was wrong in TypeScript. Hopefully you've been able to learn a little bit about the experience and some of the things that I've sort of went through and shown. I do have a couple sort of quick sort of lightning topics or lightning things that come up that I want to discuss before we leave off today, just things that come up commonly when I talk about TypeScript. The first is how to get started. So if you go to TypeScript's website, you're going to see this section here that's going to help you get the TypeScript CLI and tell you how to convert your TS files into .javascript files. So this works, and this is something that you could try out, but I'd actually recommend heading to the sort of quick start section of the TypeScript documentation. I think one of the challenges when getting started with TypeScript is dealing with the configuration. So the TypeScript CLI makes it easy to convert, say, one file to another. It's a little harder when you want to get to the point of, I want to set up an entire TypeScript sort of system to compile all of my TypeScript files in my big app into JavaScript files or a setup for dealing with that. But a lot of frameworks have provided solutions out of the box for this. So if you use, for example, the Angular CLI to create a new app, all that TypeScript stuff gets taken care of for you, and you don't really even need to know that it's happening. React through its CLI now has that. I believe Vue does as well. For NativeScript, we definitely do. If you use the NativeScript CLI to create a new project, you don't even need to know what's happening with TypeScript under the hood because we take care of all of that for you. So I'd just suggest starting with one of those approaches, especially as you're getting started, just because it'll let you actually experience and try TypeScript without having to worry about some of the messier configuration. One other question I get a lot is TypeScript similar to Flow? So if you're not familiar, Flow is a project from Facebook. I think the React team has been involved in this in some fashion as well. And it's similar to TypeScript in that it's also a static type checker. Now, Flow takes an interesting approach. Whereas in TypeScript, you write your code in .ts files, and the TypeScript compiler turns those files into .javascript files or .js files. Flow actually operates directly on the .js files, so you don't need that added little bit of code that actually changes one file to another, so you have less or fewer files in your project. So I've spent less time with Flow. The one thing I will say is that it's kind of neat because it's kind of nice having fewer files in your project and not having to worry about TypeScript versus JavaScript. I do find that Flow is a little bit slower. Because Flow doesn't have that separate TypeScript file, TypeScript just tends to know more about your code because you're providing your types, you're providing everything in line, whereas Flow has to do a little more parsing to figure that sort of thing out on the fly. So we're not talking huge. It's not like Flow is really chugging and slower, but one of the benefits of TypeScript to me is just how fast those inline suggestions are in editors like Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code. So if you're thinking about this sort of project, like if you're starting a new app and you're debating one of these static type checker tools, though, I'd at least suggest kicking the tires, trying it out, seeing what you feel about it. So what are the downsides to TypeScript? I think I've given a fairly glowing review of TypeScript, which is sort of ironic given my past with it. One of the downsides I found is just in the configuration itself. So this has come up especially as I work on bigger apps and bigger teams. TypeScript is just yet another thing to maintain, which is probably its biggest downside. If you're like me and you're a person that does not like adding any dependencies to your apps whatsoever, TypeScript is just yet another thing for you to use. TypeScript will have new versions. They will change things about their configuration files. And I personally, I couldn't tell you, I've used TypeScript for years at this point, and I couldn't tell you what a third or a half of these things are even doing at this point. So it's just something to be aware of. The other thing I would say is TypeScript, especially if you let people that are coming from a Java or C# background into your TypeScript code, sometimes they can get a little nuts with the types. TypeScript has some pretty advanced features for doing things like unions and generics and stuff like that. And in a way, to me personally, it takes away some of the purity of building on top of JavaScript with a TypeScript code base. Yeah, I've got something. This is actually a real example that appears in the TypeScript documentation that I couldn't tell you for the life of me what this thing actually does. It can get a little bit intense. So finally, what I think is sort of the most important topic and what I'm going to wrap up with is, should you use TypeScript? If you're already using TypeScript, that's great. But if you're deciding, I have a new app coming up, I'm trying to decide, should I use JavaScript app or should I use TypeScript for this application? As a developer advocate, I get asked this question quite a bit. And so what I usually respond with, the obvious answer is it depends. But what I usually ask is a handful of questions. Things like, are your apps big? So the bigger your applications are, I think the more you stand to benefit from a lot of the tooling that TypeScript provides. If you have an app that's a few files, the sort of inline syntax checking and such is nice. You still might find that valuable. But if you have a lot of files and you don't remember what folder is this code even is, what does it do, what types that I'm using, I think you'll find the suggestions that TypeScript provides a little more valuable. The second question I always ask is, do you work on a team? And especially as team size grows, I think the value of TypeScript grows as well. If you look at a lot of the TypeScript sort of success stories, a lot of them are being used for large teams to build large applications. I mean, Slack is not a small app, for example. And the same sort of thing is at work. If you're writing, say, a small application just with yourself, you're probably pretty familiar with the types that you're using for your applications and the methods you're writing. But if Jim and Sally and Joe and Bob are also on your team and working on your applications, then you can stand to be a lot more productive if you know that you're using the APIs that they wrote, and you're not going to write something that just breaks the approach that they have. So as app size goes up, TypeScript becomes more valuable. As team size goes up, the same thing is true as well. The next thing I would say is if you work on unfamiliar code bases a lot. And this one's a little bit personal to me because as someone that works on the NativeScript team and NativeScript developer advocate, people send me their random apps all the time, like something broke and I want you to take a look at what this is doing. And over time, I found I'm far happier when people send me TypeScript applications, just because it's a little easier for me to go in and start to tinker with their code. If I make a change to a file, I can tell instantly whether I broke something 3 folders over. I don't have to wait to get some bizarre compiler error and try to reverse engineer why that happened. So in your organization and your project, if you're the sort of person or your team has people that sort of jump around between apps and have a number of different applications, you might find that TypeScript is valuable in increasing your productivity. And finally, my very last note is if you have non-JavaScript developers that need to write JavaScript code. So this one, I think is interesting to me because for all that I've talked about things today from a JavaScript developer's perspective and how TypeScript is trying to appeal to the JavaScript world, what I've seen sort of out in the real world is that the people that like TypeScript the most are people that are coming from languages more like C# and Java. Because a lot of what TypeScript is doing is providing a lot of the hand-picked best features from those worlds and providing it for JavaScript developers. So if you are in an organization where perhaps you're struggling to find front-end people to do work, or you need more front-end, more people to do front-end stuff, you might find that TypeScript is an appealing way to bring in some people that are traditionally not front-end developers and make them more comfortable with sort of a front-end workflow by using TypeScript. So that's really all I have. As a couple last quick notes, if you are interested in learning more about NativeScript, nativescript.org is the place to be. I have NativeScript stickers in my backpack, so if you want a cool blue sticker for your laptop or for whatever it is you want, come see me. I'll have them up here, and you can use them. And that's really all I have, so thanks.